overall, I think if you look at the policy around COVID and post-COVID and handling of COVID, there are four dimensions of policy on which each of the speakers in different ways have commented upon. One was to deal with the lockdown itself and the response to the lockdown. The other was in terms of the recovery from the lockdown. So, once the lockdown had been chosen as a policy instrument, then how do we recover from the consequences? And the consequences have been discussed in great detail here. The third is the long-term strategy in terms of saying that, as we take these short-term measures to respond to the slowing down of the economies, what do we do in the long run to bring economies on a growth path or on a sustainable growth path? And the fourth policy response, on which the first session sort of reflected more, was to do with specifically the health sector. So if you look at the overall interventions in the area of policy, there will be four broad areas in which policy interventions have taken place. And for each one of them, as I said, the three speakers have provided a fair bit of evidence, both internationally, developed and developing economies, as well as for India, in terms of what has been done. I want to sort of draw out some general propositions from each of these, in a sense, and two statements that one Jayati made and one Chandru made makes me even more confident to push the idea that I had in mind. Jayati said that, when she talks about the kind of policy path that has been chosen in India and the consequences, people say it can't happen in a democracy. That's one statement that she made while discussing what she was describing. Chandru said in one of the, when he was looking at the fiscal policy stand, saying that it is not only the fear of finance which could explain the nature of fiscal intervention that the state has chosen. I mean, so it's not only the acts of commission, but it's also the acts of omission, and so on. So he elaborated that. And from these two, what I'm proposing for consideration here is that as far as the state is concerned, if I were to put it in one line, the larger argument that I wish to make, that as far as the state is concerned, it is pursuing with greater energy, greater vigor, policy as usual. Whatever it was doing on behalf of the rich, of whatever it was doing on behalf of capital, is going to be pursuing this with greater aggression. So the state is continuing with what it was doing, irrespective of the whole experience of the pandemic and the consequences of the pandemic. What I'm proposing is that when we are looking at the response of the state, perhaps we cannot do business as usual. In a sense, we will have to re-examine how we have been looking at the role of the state and the policy choices that the state has been making. Essentially, I say this on grounds that if the purpose of responding to policy, of the purpose of comprehending policy, is in order to address the bias in policy, to put it straightforward, then we need to also go beyond doing business as usual. And in what sense I'm saying that we need to sort of relook at the way we look at policy, I'm going to make a couple of points on that. One general, across the 4 or 5 policy segments that I've talked about, if I were to sort of characterize the nature of policy, I would say, and there is enough documentation overall as well as in the presentations today. One is that if you look at the policy response, and I'm focusing on India, if you look at the policy response, one can say that the poor and the labor in this policy response at all the 4 or 5 levels, poor was disgraced. That's one characteristics of policy that I want to underline. Second, the labor in a sort of is invisibilized in the policy making. The right to find the most humiliating, unprotective, exploitative work, pulling a rickshaw, manual cleaning, sorting out waste, that was taken away from the poor. So clearly, as I see it, this is an instance or a context in which we are looking at how labor has been publicly disgraced and how it has been invisibilized in the larger discourse. The policy that has been constructed in the last 1 year or so is based on a premise. And the premise is, and it has been publicly articulated and established through numerous ways, that the horror, torment, indignity of hunger, even during lockdown, was not something that was preventable. That was inevitable. And as a consequence, that it is the elementary duty of the state, which is our premise to respond to the policy, that it must protect the poor. That need not be the elementary duty of the state because it's inevitable. So the state has not failed, or it is not adrift. It is not that it lacks a vision, or it lacks an administrative capacity, or it lacks public compassion. None of this critiques really sticks on the state, because the state has been able to construct an alternative discourse in its space where it's tried to establish this premise that, the indignity that the labor experiences, the hunger that the labor experienced during the lockdown was not preventable. It was something that was inevitable. So the question I propose for us to examine in the larger context of policy, understanding policy, is how does the state, or how did the state in the Indian context, manage to make the lives of people dispensable? How did the state manage to do it? Because we are aware that, we have seen, the world saw the heart-wrenching images of, epic journeys of migrant workers. That did not make any difference to the approach of the state. In fact, there was, consistently callous, even cruel blaming of the migrants for not being grateful to the state. They are being misled by rumors, being irresponsible in spreading COVID, not being obedient, and so on and so forth. So the state openly carried a discourse that then they are not equal citizens, and the state did not hesitate to show that it did not have any compassion. And to me, this is the biggest puzzle, or the biggest aspect of policy making, or the shift in policy making that I want to underline for us to collectively think about. So, in fact, this period of policy making, the working poor were sort of projected and presented as dangerous, as potential carriers, as spreaders of infection. The arrogance, the cruelty of the Indian state in imposing the lockdown, which is essentially a crime against humanity, was done with great deal of, from the front foot, with great deal of, confidence and great deal of aggression. And so therefore the question is, as I said earlier, how does the state get away with such an open, sort of upfront bias against the poor? Or to ask the same question differently, how this policy discourse, this lack of will on the part of the state. I mean, we normally would, when we analyze policy, we are suggesting that there's a lack of will on the part of the state, is acting on behalf of others. I'm saying that the state has already constructed this discourse quite effectively. It's not that it's, the end of the contestation, but there is a dominant thrust of this discourse. And the question I'm suggesting is, to ask it differently, is how is this alternative discourse constructed through the democratic process, through the parliamentary process? So, if you were to look at policy and talk about inadequate documentation, bad implementation of existing laws, problems with laws pertaining to construction workers and migrant workers, neglect of unpaid workers in household production, we're talking about, neglect of labor rights in informal workers and so on. All this has been true for long. Now, in fact, we are witnessing the withdrawal of labor rights of workers beyond this, of the formal sector itself. So the broken economy now is being mended at the cost of the labor. So labor is the one that is going to pay the cost, and it is being upset up front that they will be paying the cost, because that's how the economy can be mended. So how do we explain this? And I want to make a couple of points for consideration, and and close my conversation. One, I want to say that actually what we are experiencing is a new framing of the developmental agenda in India, or should I say, a particular way of dismantling the developmentalist state in India. That's one. And, I mean, of course, there can be contesting views about whether India was a developmentalist state or not, or whatever way we construct that notion. I see that whatever was the post-independence consensus and, what we did in the last, 4 to 5 decades, now we are seeing a new framing of that development agenda. And we are also seeing a reinvention and reimagining of the labor and the labor market itself. And this is happening through a political process as well as through the democratic institutional process in the parliament. So the curtailment of rights, in this case, the labor rights, are accompanied with a supporting political process where there's a larger discourse of nationalism, and nationalism is being built by unity of sameness, not diversity. Nation is strengthened by making more and more enemies. To talk about, deep internal conspiracy, more by using some kind of exceptionalism. What applies to them will not apply to others. No one is bigger than the new nation. Too much democracy comes in the way of building a nation, and so on and so forth. So there is this larger political process where, supported by the discourse on nationalism. There's also a new framing of the development agenda. The post-COVID-19 crisis is being seriously used as an opportunity to strengthen the control of capital over labor. And that's what explains when Chandru says that, it's beyond, the fear of finance. So in the past too, we made policies, and we made policies in the name of the poor, but which benefited the rich. Previous ruling regimes diluted labor laws. There was talk of dilution of labor laws, but it was parallelly, there was also a discourse of voluntary regulation. This phase of policymaking, which had started before COVID, and now COVID has given it a new energy, everything is being done upfront. So the nation and national aspirations are being redefined. And of course, those who oppose it are outdated, not worthy of considerations, and even anti-national. The pushing this agenda through this process also serves a very important goal. It serves a very important goal, which is that it puts the onus for the current precarious conditions, say, of the workers, not on the government, but on a regulatory framework, which is a hangover from the past. So it actually abdicates the state of owning any responsibility. So when it came to the lockdown, and when it came to dealing with the humiliation of the migrant workers and the workers in general, the state abdicated itself by making the argument that, or by indirectly building this argument that this is something inevitable. The state could not do anything about it, and and the rest of the now we can bring out data and say that that didn't work. The cost that we paid was much higher in proportion to what we saved, and so on and so forth, in comparison with other countries. But in that phase, this common sense was constructed, and similarly, when it came to pushing the agenda at the policy-making level in terms of the short-term recovery and long-term changes, this idea that the responsibility for their precarious condition is a hangover for the past, helps the state to abdicate all its responsibility towards the working people. So workers have been led down by archaic laws, not by government. So in fact, the government is now working in favor of the labor or in favor of the workers to get them, help them overcome the burden that they had been experiencing because of the regulatory framework. And this scheme of, political discourse, political dialogue fits with everything else, because the nation has been now trained in many ways to think where the victims are perpetrators. We had seen this, whether it's small instance in a national scale, small instance in the case of the violence that took place on January 5th in Jawaharlal Nehru University, whether you look at the whole discourse around CEA. So now this principle is being applied to the vast majority of laboring people in this, that the victims themselves are perpetrators. So those who experienced hunger, starvation, unemployment, humiliation, indignity, and death during the lockdown are actually responsible in a way for their precarious existence. So they are being told that the attempt by the state to overprotect them in the past has made them more vulnerable. So since workers are responsible for their precarity, they will have to pay the cost, not only of the lockdown, but also of rebuilding the economy, livelihood and lives in the post-COVID-19 India. And I think this is something that we need to understand, because when we look at and we critique the policy discourse, we need to be aware too that, at some point, the details of the, and the documentation that we do in terms of what the policies have done have to respond to this, this common sense. I've been long suggesting that, since this government has come to power, it is reconstructing the two basic elements of public consciousness, and one is restructuring what is public common sense, and also reconstructing the idea of the notion of justice and what is just. And it's been busy reconstructing these, images and imagining of these two in the common population across the board through multiple channels. So this is not the time to talk about that. So this is the reason why when you change the labor laws, the government did not even respond to justify how these changes in the labor laws make sense in terms of whether it benefits the labor or not, whether it will bring investment or not. No evidence was provided. Whether it will foster growth or not, no justification is required. So how do we possibly explain government's preoccupation of changing laws when millions of migrants are walking home on foot under adverse circumstances? And the government does it. So what do we pin it to? Do we pin it to apathy? Do we pin it to incompetence? Do we pin it to lack of information? I would be actually, in fact, quite pleased if any of these suggestions were true. To me, this hostile attitude is very intentional. There is a cold, calculated logic behind the premises that informs policy, particularly to deal with COVID in the post-COVID. And in fact, I'm using a larger framework here. If you see the work of Andrew Symonds in the context of Gujarat earthquake, and it's a work where he looks at 6 years, 6 to 7 years. He looks at post earthquake reconstruction experience in Gujarat, and the leadership was same then. One gets the insight of the process of how that was achieved and how similar understanding, not replicating, but similar understanding is being applied now. What I'm suggesting again, therefore, is that something larger is being attempted here. In terms of reinvention and reimagination of labor, or locating labor in the national and social policy discourse. That's why it's unconcerned with highest level of unemployment seen in 45 years. It was unconcerned even before. You remember the elections, and how the data was not allowed to be openly discussed. They knew when they implemented the lockdown what was the landscape in the labor market, how Indian economy and how Indian labor was squeezed as a result of demonetization, GST, and the rest. So the high numbers of unemployment, the precarity of employment, this landscape was known. Over that landscape, with same amount of callousness, the state implemented its lockdown. And so in a sense, the state could publicly defend that it's not willing to acknowledge the history and reality of this country, and it got away with it in a significant way. I also want to suggest for consideration here that if you look at the events that have happened in the last 1.5 years, and the way the policy is being constructed and the direction in which we are going, I would say that when we are looking at policy and responding in terms of where we go, the distinctions that we make in terms of the working class, in terms of organized, unorganized, formal, informal, migrant, local, as far as the policy discourse is being concerned, they are being narrowed down. Our response to the crisis and the humiliation, indignity, and the precarity that these segments of labor face is to seek policies that address the specificities of these categories of labor. But if you look at the response of policymaking, that's actually trying to now sort out these distinctions and collectively bring labor as an entity with the same rights which the informal workers had in the past. So the hunger and the hardship the workers experienced were across the board. The documentation of the various surveys that the Azim Premji puts on the dashboard. If you look at it, It's true that in relative terms, the suffering was more of the informal workers and so on. But even in the organized sector, the suffering was very high. The changes that were made in the labor laws, the farm laws, which is not it's not a special focus with COVID, but I link it with COVID, also reinforces the same process. So the state is once again willing to make laws, not justify them, but implicitly suggest to us that it is willing to create this vast reserve army in the rural areas of India, with again, great deal of callousness and great deal of sort of confidence. And it's continuing to push that agenda ahead. So I see, if this was the way I would understand the larger policy making, having learned the details from the presentations that were just done, I propose for consideration of all the three and other people who are participant here, who are very keen observers of policy and labor market, for your consideration, three directions in which I see the changes in the labor market. I feel that, post-COVID, there will be selective induction of the, of the core labor force, accompanied by a technological shift. We were talking about it in terms of the fourth industrial revolution, etc., before COVID came. And I think, if you look at, in terms of salaried jobs and how much have been lost and how much have recovered, I think lot of changes in the business and the way business is done and the way it's organized, and it will be supported by policy. There'll be a selective induction of, a core labor force, which will be, accompanied by a technological shift. Large amounts of labor, which has been pushed back to the rural areas, to the distressed areas. Actually, new forms of, and as far as state is concerned, new forms of patronage will be built via schemes, because the government will have to, because the Jayati's question that how does it happen in democracy? So some kind of patronage will be built via schemes locally where the workers have gone back. There'll be some kind of transfers taking to to sections of the working force there. New kinds of new bondage will be with the segments of the working class would be built by also regulating the mobility of labor. So, there will be this, some kind of welfare schemes, nothing based on rights, nothing based on entitlements, but in terms of how the labor has been repositioned in terms of, the new dynamics of capital labor relations. I think that the response would be at one level, I said, selective induction into core labor force, accompanied by technological shift. Second, I see that, wherever the labor has been pushed, their mobility is constrained and curtailed, in a major way, not through regulation and law, but through the control of train, buses, and promotion of private buses. It's a very strange thing. I mean, I live at the sort of intersection of two states. And, if you go out in the evening, the use of private buses for the poor is completely changed after COVID. Trains, that what percentage of trains that have been restored, how many are trains that the poor and the working class can use, and how many aren't. How many, if you look at the public transport and the irregularity of the public transport, there are limits to which it can use. So I have seen workers coming from Bihar in private buses, either through contractors in those, two-tier buses, what they call as sleeper buses, from Bihar going to Visakhapatnam. Something that I don't think that it was, happening before at the scale, at least, which is happening. I haven't documented it. I'm saying it from anecdotal experience, but I think, and if you look at, the political discourse that, for example, the UP chief minister has unleashed in terms of, where the labor can go and can't go, I feel that this restructuring of the mobility of labor is also happening. So there is taking away of all the rights of labor to organize and bargain with capital, and then restructuring the labor market in some of the ways that I have suggested, rationalizing their policy discourse through a political process and democratic process that I elaborated earlier. All of this resulting into a new kind of capital labor dynamics in India. And if you are looking at this capital labor dynamics, not in terms of just achieving growth rates, but in terms of political response of how do we organize and how do we respond to these changing capital labor relations, I think we'll have to acknowledge some of the facts that I've underlined. Thank you.